All right, I am Dr. Weaver, and this is Introductory Sociology at OSU OKC, and we're going to start today with Chapter 1. It's all new and exciting at this point. It will soon be not new, but comfortable. Okay, so we are here for sociology, the scientific study of society and human behavior. Sociology is a social science. And science is a very particular, special, separate way of knowing things. I mean, there's other ways of knowing things, right? Aesthetics, beauty, is a way of knowing things. Philosophy is a way of knowing things. Theology is a way of knowing things. Sociology is not any of that. And those are great, right? I really enjoyed my philosophy courses. I really enjoyed my theology courses. I really enjoy, beauty as truth, but we are going for things that happen as truth. Now, if you have been upstairs, you have seen this on the wall by the elevator, right? And I would like to say, I picked out that poster. I picked out the poster. I requested that the department buy the poster. When the poster arrived, I unpacked the package. I went to the wall frame. I took out the picture of this building that was there, and I swapped in that poster, and I would like to say I feel deeply and profoundly ambivalent about that poster. Now, we picked this poster for a reason. We picked this poster because employers, what they really want more than technical skills, because they can teach you technical skills, is someone who can think, who can write, who can solve problems, who can communicate clearly, who can get along with other people. Critical thinking, and this is a gen ed course, a general education course, critical thinking is core to gen ed. Now I say the words critical thinking, and half of you flinched because it sounds really hard and scary. It's this elusive, weird thing, this mystical property employers want. But what really is it? And what it really is not that big a deal, right? It's understanding cause and effect. It's being able to guess what's going to cause problems. It's understanding how different ideas are related. It's being able to look at a situation and think creatively about solutions. It's about looking at an argument and being able to point out the holes in it, right? Oh, you have this magnificent plan for rebuilding the roads. Let's think about where the traffic might, go nuts during this, right? It's being able to take ideas apart. That's all. But we're pushing critical thinking. It's important that you not only can do it, but know you can do it and do it with confidence. So this poster is very popular upstairs. However, I teach a science, and we are interested in facts. We want to know what really happened. I believe that the world exists, and that the items in the world can be counted and measured, that we can notice if they change over time. I believe that events happen. So it is just as every bit as important that you apply logic and do critical thinking, that you also do your critical thinking about things that actually happen, right? That you base your decisions on data, and that your first impulse is to make sure your data is accurate, right? To make sure that you are working from reliable, true information. Because having great judgment does you no good at all if you've got facts that aren't true, right? So this is why I am ambivalent about the poster. I am 100% in favor of thinking as absolutely necessary, but I am very equally anxious to make sure that you're paying attention to the factual details. One of my favorite stories is Dr. Collins was in here before. Last spring, they had two students in his civil rights class arguing over something. One of them was saying, this issue is a big problem. And the other student was saying, this issue is not a big problem. And one of the students said, wait a minute. I remember in sociology, they said, check the facts. So let me look it up on my phone, how statistically common this is. He says, yeah, there are way too many of these. There are millions of these problems a year. It's a real problem. We should be doing something about it. That's the moment I'm going for. Everybody good? All right. That said, so Here is sociology. Let's start again. We are going to use logic and analysis and creativity. We are also going to pay attention to facts. We are going to do this to study social groups and group interactions. We're going to study little tiny groups, like you and the person you're dating, or you and your spouse and kids, or you and the group at work who are assigned to a joint project. And we're going to do it to study really huge groups of people. The population of the world, the population of China, 1.6 billion people. They have a society. How in the world? The state of Oklahoma, a little more than 3 million people. All of this is what we look at. To do that, we need a definition. We're going to start with the definition of the word society. That's people who share a culture and a territory. Culture we'll spend a lot of time on later. Culture is everything you've learned so far, the languages you speak, the skills you have. Do you drive on the right side of the road? Is red the sign to stop and green the sign to go? What a bad idea that is. One out of every man is colorblind, but there you are. Do you eat with a fork and knife, or just spoons, or just chopsticks, or your fingers, or folded bread? Do you eat beef, or crickets, or lamb, or guinea pigs? Domesticated not as a pet, I'm afraid. Do you wear, when you wear clothes, what is absolutely necessary that you cover? Can you wear white shoes after Labor Day? How do you indicate to someone that you would be interested in dating them? Are you expected to pick your own marital partner, or will your parents obligingly hire a professional? Or will you try to pick a computer company to pick your future spouse? Yeah, listen to the nervous giggles. Picking a spouse is incredibly difficult and uncomfortable. It's our culture. It's not just culture, it's also territory. When I did my graduate research, I worked with Russian Christian Orthodox believers in New Jersey and in Russia. And New Jersey, although many of the older communities had worked very hard to maintain a very close relationship with the church at home, they were clearly separate societies, right? See, our society is still got, I mean, yes, there's all social media now. Yes, we have travel to the other side of the world in less than 12 hours. Society, community, still has a big geographic component. The next thing to talk about is the sociological perspective. And this was a big, surprising deal back in the first half of the 20th century, when C. Wright Mills, he's the next slide, starts talking about it. Some of this probably has seeped enough into the popular culture that when I describe it to you, you're going to go, okay, yeah, I get that. That's not that complicated. See, the tendency is to look at your life and the lives of everyone around you as individual instances. Did you finish high school? Did you go to college right away? What college did you choose? What job did you take? How old were you when you got married? Did you get divorced? How many kids did you have? Did you join the army? Were you ever fired? Were you ever laid off? How many times in your life have you changed jobs? We think about these things as individual events, as individual experiences. And they're mostly driven by ourselves, my desires, my talents, my skills, my luck. But Mills said, no, wait a minute. every decision everybody makes, everything that happens to people that's beyond their control is embedded in society. First off, there's the whole issue of culture, right? The kinds of jobs that you think are possible, that you think are desirable, that's your culture. Whether you believe you should have one spouse or 5 spouses, that's your culture. Whether you think sexual fidelity is important, that's your culture. It all happens in a background of shared expectations of how people are supposed to behave. In addition to that, there's issues of social structure, how your society is organized. Are you working class or working poor or middle class or rich? Do you live in a rural community with not a lot of job choices, not a lot of services? Or do you live in a really big city where there's lots of public transportation and lots of different kinds of jobs? Is your society a really small community that's basically organized and the family determines who you work with and who you eat with and who you live with in the house? And the family are the people you see every day? And everybody in your community is related to you by either blood or marriage? That's most of human history right there. Or do you live your lives surrounded by strangers? Ooh, did anybody in here know anybody else in here before today started? Anybody here with some friends? Is it you two? And you're not sitting together, so you must strongly dislike each other. Then for most of human history, the idea of being surrounded by strangers is just incomprehensible. And here we go through all day, every day. That's part of our social structure. Then there's also the structure of the whole society. Where are you in it? What job are you doing? What job do you want? How much education do you have? What generation are you? Right? We are just now making the transition from Generation Y, millennials, to Generation Z, which we don't know very much about yet. Apparently, millennials have killed mayonnaise and chilies and the diamond industry. That's what they're saying. No, what happens is millennials have seen through diamonds and can't afford them anyway, and they're buying houses much later and they're working more jobs. Most of that is structural economic. But millennials are much more comfortable with computers than Generation X. The other professors upstairs who are millennials, they look at a website and they immediately understand how the whole thing works. And I'm reading from the top down, right? If that helps you understand me, I write my website from the top down. Start at the top and work down. Meanwhile, Generation Z we don't know very much about, except they have been digital since birth. They have a wide range of odd skills because anything they want to do, they look up a tutorial on the internet, right? Want to learn how to draw, look it up on the internet. Want to make slime, want to do fancy handcrafts, want to be a computer programmer, look it up on the internet. Also, 8 out of 10 of them think gender is a continuum, not a binary. It's going to be a hoot having more and more of them in class, I got to tell you. Right, income. The way your worldview affects your profession. Is anybody in here related to farmers? Okay. Do your farmer relatives see the world the same way as your office worker relatives? Do you have any researcher or scientific relatives? No, but they would think differently than the farmer relatives if you did, right? Because what you're doing gives you a perspective on the world. And speaking of farmers, if we were alive 200 years ago, guess what all of you would be doing for a living? You'd be farming. You would have to be married because you need two labor skill sets to farm successfully. And how many kids do you suppose you'd have? A lot. 10 would be good. People would like 10. The average was 7 live births. But you had to hedge your bets because some of them would die. And of course, every kid is more money because kids work on the farm. As we shift to the 1950s, what did most people have as a job? Most people who had a job outside the home worked in a factory. Factory, exactly. 56% of American jobs were factories. And if you were a female, you probably were a stay-at-home mom, could expect a man to take care of you, right? And those factory jobs would have overtime and vacations and retirement plans and healthcare plans, and gosh, that's nice. And now here we are, and we don't have that, right? Only 26% of jobs are factory jobs. Most people work in some kind of office arrangement, and are much more likely to be part-time, much more likely to be temporary, much less likely to have health insurance or vacation days. A quarter of American workers get no sick days. And that should alarm you if you go to a restaurant, right? Because they can't stay home if they're sick. I'm sorry, I teach social problems. I forget sometimes that it's not my job all day to horrify students. If you were born in the 1900, you would have lived through the Great Depression. Do you have any relatives who lived through the Depression? You may not at this point. Relatives who lived through the Depression have lots of food in their cabinets, don't they? They never throw anything out, right? And of course, in Oklahoma, your experience would also be shaped by the, what, of the 1920s? Dust Bowl, when Kansas went to visit Texas for a while and then came back. Then there was World War II, right? And the 1950s, when those factory jobs were great, and the 1960s, and a lot of young men got drafted to go to Vietnam. And it feels like your life experience is your life experience, but in fact there are millions of people in the same boat, the same historic boat, facing the recessions, facing the economic or geological or weather disasters, right? Facing the same earthquakes, facing the same booms, right? In the late 1990s, a lot of you would have skipped college and gone straight into computer programming, right? Because that's what, you could make $100,000 like that if you had the right. And then, of course, we had the dot-com burst in 2001, and all of those computer programmers became real estate agents, right? And all of this feels like it's just you. It's the sociological imagination that lets us connect all of these things together. That lets us connect social structure, culture, history, and the individual biographies, the experiences people are living through. Questions? Comments? Can you see how this might be useful in your future careers? If you see how the big picture affects individual people, you can make better choices when you're making plans for your city government, or the company you're working for, or the company you're thinking about starting. Taking a look at the big picture will also maybe be helpful to you as individuals, as you decide when or how or who to marry, maybe, or how many kids to have, or what the social factors are that cause divorce. Here's the big picture. If you look at divorce rates over the last 60 years, there is one group that divorce rates have not gone up for: the rich. You be upper middle class and rich, and your odds of getting divorced are exactly what they were in 1955. Hail family values.
It's easier to keep them than lose all your stuff.
It's easier to, well, that's true. And of course, divorce hits you much harder when you're poor. If you're, working poor or lower middle class, divorce will mess you both up for a year. At least. Good so far? Okay. Let's talk, okay. So let's back up a couple of big steps and talk about how we got sociology. Because, of course, the thing is, we talk about science like it's pouring out truth, but in fact, science is the search for truth. And in the beginning, if we were inventing psychology and brain biology now, would they be two different disciplines? No. If we were inventing physics and chemistry right now, would we be putting them in two different departments? No. If we were inventing sociology right now, we'd put it in the same bucket as anthropology. But sociology, like chemistry, like physics, well, like history, but history was invented way earlier, were all invented at some point with specific goals to answer specific questions, and that's shaped the directions it's taken. For most of human history, society was like water. You're wondering what that fish was doing. What that fish is doing is not noticing what he's submerged in, because it's so obvious, because it's everywhere, because it's not something you can question. Well, I say that. Philosophers questioned. Philosophers asked, why is it like this? What is it all for? Who are humans really? And I really liked the philosophy classes I took. I almost minored in it. But the thing with philosophy is, a lot of the philosophers were looking for oughts. How should things be? Other philosophers were so enamored of their pretty examples and metaphors. I'm thinking of like Plato in the cave. Oh my gosh, he just loved to go on about that beautiful image of the cave. How useful is the cave, really? If you haven't had philosophy, someday you may. It's beautifully, wonderful, amazing, mind-bending, but I would much rather pay attention to what is actually going on. So I'm here and not there. Also, your theology courses may ask, what is it all for? Why are we here? But they're always asking it from the perspective of what does God want us to do? And that's great. I enjoyed my theology classes. But that is not this, right? Okay. Sociology starts because of some interesting things that happened in the 1700s. We could start earlier than the 1700s. We could start with the Crusades, right? When Europe kept invading the Middle East and Eastern Europe. The Russians are still mad about the Crusades. It's only been 800 years. Well, because the Catholics burned Constantinople. Yeah. Americans are very short grudge keepers compared to Eastern Europe. And Southern Europe. Right. Then they brought back all of the stuff from ancient Greece and Rome that the Muslims had kept in their libraries. They brought back copies of all the ancient plays and all the ancient math. And when this stuff hit Europe, educated people went, wow, this is cool. And they started reading it like crazy. And then, of course, the printing press came along. That's a big one, right? I mean, before the printing press, that's the 1400s, I'm pretty sure. If you wanted to learn how to fish, what did you have to have? A friend who could fish, right? If you wanted to learn how to stitch a wound shut, you had to have a friend who could already do it. With the appearance of books, you didn't have to have a person physically there. You could take lessons from someone who'd been dead for hundreds of years, right? And that would be the best fishermen, the best doctors, the best mathematicians in the world. So the printing press spreads this out, and Europe goes crazy. And we start to have the Renaissance, right? Da Vinci and all the cool painters painting and perspective and all of the math, right, that came from the Arabs through the Spanish and X, right? Because when you solve for X, they used the letter X because they didn't have a letter for the first letter of the word that the Arabs were using for their math. Yeah! See, we think it's not history, it's all history. So by the time you get to the end of the Renaissance, when they have done all the things that could be done with the great works from history, all the great plays and all the great math and all the great histories, they said, all right, what are we doing now? And what happened was the Enlightenment. Now, if you've had Western civilization, do you know what the Enlightenment was? What was the Enlightenment?
The Enlightenment was where, like, people were really beginning to think for themselves.
People were starting to think originally, and they were less into the divine right of kings, right? More into the value of the individual, more into logic and reason, and more into facts. Before the Enlightenment, where did people think maggots came from? Don't make a face. Maggots were a miracle. maggots were the hand of God bringing unlife to life, right? You had a piece of meat, and part of the decaying process of the meat was that life arose on it. The dead thing became living. And then an Enlightenment researcher came along, a scientist, and he had two pieces of meat, and he covered one up with a glass bowl that had a screen on it that was a little hole to let air in, but no way a bug could get in, and one that was left open, and he watched them and discovered that one piece of meat had flies land on it, and the other didn't, and one of them got, maggots, and the other didn't. They tried the same thing with tadpoles, right? Up until obviously country people knew better. But city people honestly thought that tadpoles were a miracle, that the mud at the bottom of the puddle was coming to life and swimming around. Isn't that a beautiful picture? I like that. That's so sweet. But no, in fact, once you cover up puddles and start testing things and observing things, you notice that there are frogs getting on in the puddle. And the frogs lay eggs, and the eggs hatch into tadpoles. And this is not a coincidence. This is where the other one does not. The one that is covered does not get tadpoles. Now this guy in the picture, his name is Auguste Comte. He was French. He was a philosopher. He wrote all sorts of famous stuff, and he really, really, really liked the Enlightenment. He liked a thing called positivism, the idea that you can find out, that if you are systematic in your observations, if you notice all the details, if you measure and record everything, if you test theories and are absolutely precise and accurate, you're going to find out anything. The positivists believe if you just got the research tools right, telescopes, sextants, you could understand all sorts of things about stars in the sky. And yes, the Earth is not the center of, well, that's of course, early Renaissance. The Earth is not the center of the universe. And look at all the moons around Mars. The positivists believe that if you paid attention to the rocks in the ground, you could know the history of the Earth. They believed if you paid attention to the clouds, you could understand the weather. That if you paid attention to the animals, well, do you remember Mendel and his genes? Breeding peas, and then later on I think it was fruit flies. Come up with your hypothesis, test your hypothesis, be specific, be exact. You can learn anything. So this is what Comte was thrilled about. There was a thing Comte was kind of not so happy about, and that was all the social change going on in the 1700s. Now, in sociology, we date the Industrial Revolution to 1765. That's where we think it really took off, although, frankly, the technology was there. It could have happened early. It didn't. Does anybody remember what the Industrial Revolution was? What was that? What does the Industrial Revolution make you think of? Factories. That's right. That's when we started getting big into factories. Before the Industrial Revolution, human labor produced most of the wealth. The Industrial Revolution meant that machines run by fuel started producing most of a society's wealth. And it changed everything. In Europe in particular, before the Industrial Revolution, there were peasants, there were serfs. And they lived on land controlled by lords, by barons and dukes and whatnot. And they were more or less property. I mean, in Russia, more property. In England, less property, but you couldn't leave without the landowner's permission. You couldn't get married without the landowner's permission. In some areas, on your wedding night, the landowner slept with your wife. You had to work 3 days in the owner's field. You had to give him half your crop. And when he went to war, you had to provide young men from your community to go with your kids, to go with him. It sounds like a really bum rap, doesn't it? And it was a pretty bum rap. These people were pretty poor. Their houses, had dirt floors. Sometimes they lived with the sheep. But if you were invaded, your landowner owed you protection. If your neighbor stole your sheep, your landowner owed you justice. If there was a dispute between you and other people in the community, or someone committed a crime with you, the landowner was supposed to settle it. If the crops failed, the landowner's job was to make sure you didn't starve, which is not to say all landowners were good. Not all landowners met their obligations. Not all peasants met their obligations. But it was a system that was the same, almost identical, from decade to decade. for a very long time. It was predictable, it was sustainable, and at least you knew what it was. It was hard, it was bad, but it wasn't a surprise. And then along came the Industrial Revolution, and all of a sudden these factories grow up, and these factories want to make cloth. You make cloth out of cotton and flax and wool. So all of northern England, landowners looked around and went, you know, we could make a whole lot more money kicking off these peasants and putting up sheep. So now you've got the rich people with money building the factories, buying the wool from the rich people with money who own land, and what happened to the farmers? You don't need as many people to take care of sheep as you did to grow oats or wheat or turnips or potatoes. Where'd they go? They kicked off, went to the cities, got jobs in the factories. But there weren't any minimum wage laws. There weren't any worker safety laws. There weren't any overtime laws. There weren't any child labor laws. So the factories were dirty and dangerous, and you worked there for 10 hours a day or more, 6 days a week. And if you lost an arm, there was no workers' comp. And the cities were full of people who, they were full of people, which was a problem because what happens when cities grow too fast? Before you have a sewage system in place.
Nowhere for waste to go.
It's the river.
Out of the window.
It's out the window. It's down the street. That's gross. Also, you got all those factories. There are no pollution laws. Everybody's got respiratory problems because of the air pollution. I mean, not see the other side of the road air pollution a lot of days. On top of all of that, because there was no safety and no child labor, a lot of work in factories was for kids, and a big factory could expect a kid to die on the job 4 times a year. That was okay, they were cheap, you could buy more. They also put kids to work in mines. Those are kids in a factory right there. So this is hard, this is stinky, this is exhausting. There weren't roads in to bring in, fresh fruit and vegetables and good meat. So there was an awful lot of foodborne illness or dietary deficiencies because you're not getting enough vitamin C. I mean, say what you want about how awful it is to be a peasant, at least the diet is varied and nutritious. When you're a peasant, you've got a bucket of oatmeal over the fire all day, and some elderly person at home to stir it. And oatmeal is good for you. When you move to the city, you're feeding your kids bread with jam. Bread with jam may be more popular. Yay, sugar. It is not as good for you. And you are also discovering the joys of dental cavities. Much less of a problem when you don't have refined sugar. You don't have refined sugar when you don't have factories. So they're looking around in Europe in the 1700s, they're going, what happened? Why are all these poor people in the cities? What happened to the sweet, gentle countryside and the happy peasants working the land? Why is there so much crime? Why is there so much poverty? Why does everything smell so bad? Why is everybody sick? What caused this? What's going to happen next? How is it going to affect me? Social change breeds really tense, nerve-wracking, upsetting questions. And Comte said, I have the answer. The answer is we are going to apply positivism to society and we'll explain everything. Comte wrote an essay, a very famous, very long essay, talking about how he had invented the best science ever. He had a huge ego. The most important science the world had ever heard of, the queen of the sciences. It would solve all the most important problems because it would study human communities, and he named it sociology. Yay, Comte. And then he proceeded not to do any sociology. I mean, at this point, you've got this great idea. Go out and study something. But no, he went and sat down in his little office, and he wrote stuff he thought might be true. He took no data, performed no interviews, did no surveys, had no hypotheses, tested nobody else's hypotheses. So at this point, our story leaves Comte and moves to England, where very unusually, there was a woman in England who had a job. I mean, not a factory job. It was usual to have a factory job. Her job was translating popular works from the French into the English so more English-speaking people could read them. Her name was Harriet Martineau. And she translated Comte's essay. And when she got to the end of it, she said, wow, I want to do this. So she packed up her trunks and hopped on a boat and went to the United States and traveled through the United States studying, are you ready for it? Poverty, racism, and sexism in the 1800s. She wrote a book, which of course nobody cared about because she was a woman. And at this point, our story leaves Harriet Martineau. I don't want to talk about Karl Marx. He was an interesting political theorist. When he said factory work was unfair and brutal and people were being exploited, that was all true. But almost everything he said about history and everything I can think of that he said about the way society works was just plain wrong. Because he wasn't a very good historian and he wasn't a social scientist he was only concerned with injustice. And the problem was injustice is linked to everything else. And you can't see where it's going if you're only seeing, he was a philosopher, let's face it, talking about the way things ought to be. So moving on from Marx, there was a guy in England who read Harriet Martineau's book called Herbert Spencer. And he thought, wow, this is a great idea. I want to do some of that. The question he was interested in was, why are rich people rich and poor people poor? This is interesting, right? Are we not still interested in this? Things are looking pretty good for sociology right now, aren't they? No. Because instead of going out and collecting data, he went into his office and wrote a paper saying that rich people are rich and poor people are poor because rich people are better than poor people. That is not sociology. But it made him very popular with rich people who suddenly had a justification. Yeah, there's all kinds of poverty and things are stinky and people are dying, but it's supposed to be that way. Can't be any other way. We like sociology. Let's get some more of that. What they got was a French guy named Émile Durkheim. He studied a whole bunch of stuff. He'll turn up when we talk about religion. He sometimes turns up when we talk about groups. One of the things he's most famous for is studying suicide. Up until Durkheim, suicide was a sin, like murder or sleeping with the wrong person or stealing someone's cow. But while he was working at the time when governments had started keeping records of where people were born and how many people were born and cause of death, so he could compare suicide rates for different countries, and within countries compare suicide rates for individuals with different attributes. And he discovered that people are more likely to commit suicide if their ties to others in their communities are weak. That societies that have a lot of war and chaos, where there are refugees, or where there's rapid social change, or where you've recently industrialized, have higher suicide rates than countries where things are pretty consistent and steady. He discovered that comparing individuals, married individuals commit less suicide than single individuals, people who live with family or roommates less than people who live alone, people without jobs more than people with jobs, people who belong to a church or a club, much less than people who are not socially engaged. And, it was very basic, but everything he said has borne out since. I mean, we've gotten much more subtle, much more nuanced since. But he was spot on with the data he had. Good so far? Now, this guy was French. The next guy was German. They were about the same time. We're pretty sure they never actually met. The German guy, Max Weber, I know that's a W, but that's the way Germans do it. It is Max Weber. Those long German words you're going to have to learn later, his fault. He also studied a whole bunch of things. He studied social class. He studied the way organizations worked. What he is most famous for is inventing the term Protestant work ethic, which is where you tie your personal self-worth and your expression of your self, your goal, with your job, That's him. He said, if religious morals result in business reinvestment, capitalism grows. If religious morals are okay with hoarding wealth, economies stagnate. Now, I know religion in the United States is pretty much an individual thing, right? There are people in this room who are atheists, people in this room who are Catholic, people in this room who are evangelical, people in this room who are mainline Protestant, people in this room who are Wiccans, people in this room, I may have missed one, right? But back when he was working, you could expect entire societies to be mostly one way or another. So he was comparing Catholic countries and Calvinist societies. Calvinism is the kind of Protestantism that comes out of, Scotland? Calvin. See, if you are Catholic and you've committed a sin and you're worried about going to hell, what can you do about it? You go to a priest, you confess to a priest, exactly. And you get absolution, you do the penance, you get to stop worrying about hell. But if you are a Calvinist, you got other problems, because Calvinists believed that God knew everything. That's not actually crazy, is it? No. If God knows everything, God knows what's going to happen to you. If God knows what's going to happen to you, he knows whether you're going to hell or not. Oh dear. If God knows you're going to hell, is there anything you can do about it? At this point, the Calvinists freaked all the heck out because they were afraid of hell and there wasn't a darn thing they could do. However, they assumed there would be signs. You would be able to tell who was going. For example, people who were immoral would not be going to heaven. So they tried to be people who were serious, hardworking, honest, not vain. That was important, not being vain. No fancy clothes, no fancy carriages, no showing off. Make sure you give your tithe to the church. But maybe that wasn't enough. Maybe there were people who did all of those things and they were still going to hell. And then they thought, oh, wait, God wouldn't let the elect be poor. So they worked really hard to not be poor. Now this brings up an interesting new problem. You are working really, really hard. You see your work as an expression, as your service to God, just like you were a monk. And you can't spend it on fancy clothes or fancy carriages or fancy houses. And you've already donated to the church. What do you do with the extra money? When you have enough money, do you get to stop working? No, you don't. When you have enough money, you reinvest it in the business. Now, when you reinvest in the business, there are two possible outcomes. The first is it doesn't work out and you lose it. That new product line you were wrong finger. I'm sorry. Russians never leave, I can't do it. Russians never leave the index finger pointing up because that's pointing at someone is cursing them. So little old Russian ladies would start counting with their middle finger, right, straight up in the air. And it's weird when you're American being flipped off by little old Russian ladies. We'll talk about symbols tomorrow. So anyway, two things can happen. Two things. One of them is you lose the money because it just didn't work the way you expected, or you get more money. But we have an aphorism about that, don't we? You have to spend money to make money. The only way your business is going to grow is if you invest in it. So for the first 100 years the first couple of 100 years after, mid-1700s to late 1800s, that's 150 years of the American experiment in capitalism, we were growing like gangbusters. And so were other countries leaning in a Calvinist direction. Right? It's not like that anymore. Rich people hoard stuff like crazy now. But then, right? You reinvest. Was he right? Well, I think he was right. But this is not the kind of thing you can prove because we can't set up an experiment for it. All right, by the early 20th century, Durkheim and Weber had kicked things off to a great start. The United States opened 3 sociology departments in colleges. It caught on to be a moderately popular science during the early 20th century. At this time, social workers and sociologists got the exact same training. You did both jobs at once. You taught your college classes Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Tuesday and Thursday, you were at the soup kitchen or the halfway house or the crisis pregnancy center or, that was an unwed mother's home in those days. You were working with the police to make there be less violence. You were arguing for prison reform. You were trying to make the world a better place. The assumption was if you knew the cause of violence, of crime, of poverty, if you knew the cause, you could fix it. Our example from this time period is a sociologist named W.E.B. Du Bois. He spent his lifetime studying racism and poverty. He wrote, are you ready? 400 books and articles. 400. That is not a typo. But he wasn't just a researcher. He was also out there to save the world. He helped found the NAACP. Right? And this was, in the early 20th century, the ideal sociologist. Good so far? Now, as we get to the middle-ish of the 20th century, wait, why is that there? I don't know why that slide is there. As we get to the middle of the 20th century, students and young sociologists began to get a little restless, right? I mean, they looked around and they said, we've been trying to save the world for 40 years now, and the world still has problems. There is still crime. Prisons are still bad places that don't rehabilitate. Teenagers still get pregnant. People are still poor. We have watched our teachers spend their lives trying to fix the world, and racism and sexism still exist. And perhaps we don't want to spend our lives pushing this boulder uphill that never reaches the top. Aww. On the other hand, they were also kind of jealous of the other cooler sciences. What sciences were really cool in the 30s and the 40s? Well, psychology was cool. Psychology had Freud. Freud was a theorist. Freud talked about the id, the ego, and the superego. Freud had a theory. Freud was cool. You know what else was cool? Physics was cool. Everybody knew the big theory in physics, E equals mc squared. Everybody who could wanted to be a physicist. That was the cool science. But sociology didn't have any theories. Sociology was like the kid sitting all by itself and not getting any friends. So these young students sat down and said, all right, what have we got? We've been churning out observations for the last, 50, 60 years. What have we really learned? We need, at this point, the idea of a theory. A theory is just, the word sounds scary. It's just explaining cause and effect. It explains the way two events are related. A theory is just a fancy way of saying, this is what we think is really going on. And looking at the kinds of theories, the kind of explanations sociologists had already come up with, they said, oh, look, we have macro-level theories talking about big social things like the divorce rate. And why is the divorce rate not always the same? Or the crime rate. And why is the crime rate not always the same? Or what causes war, right? These are big things. And we also have little things. Like the social that's big, scary. Social construction of reality. Like how do we decide what the holidays are? Like how do we decide what Santa Claus should look like? Like, okay, the divorce rate of the society is really interesting, but what causes individual couples to get divorced? Hypothesis. Couples who argue over money are more likely to get divorced than couples who argue over sex. Turns out that's not it. Hypothesis. Couples who argue fairly and don't hold grudges and don't attack and defend themselves are less likely to divorce than couples that are mean to each other. That one works. When we hit the chapter on marriage and family, we will talk about the 4 things you can do to ensure that you will get the divorce you always wanted. Oh, whoops, sorry. Avoid the divorce you have always dreaded. These are the 3 theories we've got. There are 2 macro theories, 2 big picture theories, and 1 little theory. And write down the names of them, but we'll go into them in more detail on Thursday. Structural functionalism sees society as having all the parts connected together and working together. Economy and family and government and mass media and religion and education have to work together like your heart and lungs and stomach and liver and kidneys, or society dies out. Conflict theory says, no, it's not about cooperation. Society is just groups of people competing for resources. And symbolic interactionism, that's the micro one that says, you know, that's really great. How does your society decide what's important? How do you and the person next to you and your family members come to an agreement on what's beautiful, on what the holidays mean, on what you want from a marriage? And we'll spend some time playing games with that on Thursday. You are free.